But now look at the fake news. Imagine somebody's living in Africa and they know somebody with river blindness. And these activists are putting out lies to thousands upon thousands of retweets. And these people have the internet. And what happens when someone says, look, it's going to hurt you. The white people are coming and they're going to hurt you. And they stop taking it. Because when Ebola broke out, there were so I know journalists who went and covered Ebola. They went on the ground in some of these villages, and people would break out of quarantine because they thought the doctors coming to treat them were actually hurting them. And they were all superstitious, and they believed that you could transfer the curse and things like that. If you have impoverished and uneducated villages, and we are desperately trying to help cure their ailments and educate them and teach them, what happens when these activists start pumping out insane lies, Rachel Maddow's lies, when they're saying that ivermectin's a horse dewormer? All of those lies from the media are going to be scaring people who are already worried about being manipulated. You've already got, Joe Biden talking about the Tuskegee experiments. Granted, he said Tuskegee Airmen, but you get the point.
And by the way, like the New York Times had an article about the percentage of young African Americans in New York City who've been vaccinated. I think it's something like 27% or something when they wrote it. It's probably gotten higher since then. But they interviewed some people, and some people were saying, why am I scared of COVID? I'm way more scared of getting shot by the police. It's like, the news media spent, 18 months or so, or I don't know how long, but around that, probably longer if you count back out to 2014 or Ferguson, telling people to be scared to death of getting shot by the cops, particularly if you're African American. Now you have people going around and just random people are being interviewed on the street saying, no, I'm way more scared of getting shot by the cops than I am by COVID. Like 700,000 people in the United States have been killed by COVID-19, right? Around 1,000 people a year are shot and killed by police officers. I mean, it's very easy math to say that COVID is much, much bigger risk than police shootings. But I think if you went back to these journalists who promoted a lot of the police shooting stories and asked them, well, why didn't you at least put some statistical context in there? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? They'd probably say, are you minimizing, the shooting of black men by police officers? And I'm like, no, I just want you to report the truth. I want you to report the totality, the context, the statistical data that would let people know like what the actual risk looks like for them, because it has a real practical meaning to people's lives.
Yeah, one of the things that we've talked about quite a bit is that you've got kids growing up with Facebook being inundated with nothing but videos of police brutality, and then genuinely believing that cops are doing this every day. They're actively seeking people out. I mean, we've heard BLM activists say like, oh, they're hunting us down, and that's just not true. But I don't think it's as activist-y. I mean, maybe it is. Maybe it's activists who are watching. Imagine you're 10 years old. You're inundated by nothing of these videos. And now you're 18, 20, you're in college. You get out, you go get a job at, Vox or whatever, and you believe it, so you start writing it. But I do think there's a lot of people, when they give you their excuses and their justifications, it's because they're grifters. It's because they're like, dude, I got 2 million clicks on that. My boss paid me a bonus. I'm not going to admit I did wrong, right? These people are unwilling to correct the record because it's the rage that gets them the traffic. Now, me, I got to be honest. I think what gets me the traffic is admitting when I'm wrong. I think the viewers we have are specifically here because we do corrections and we will admit when we're wrong. And I'm really strict with Timcast.com on like any change, anything, punctuation. I want a note saying what we changed and why. I want a record of that. So people go there can see it. Media doesn't do that. I think you've got true believers who have been indoctrinated. And I think I think the grifters are on the way out, to be honest. And now you're getting true believers coming in. They've eaten their own, they've fed this refuse to the children. And that's probably why you don't get journalists anymore. You get activists.
Well, there was an analogy. I did some work for an organization that was headed by Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist. There's a really good analogy for changing your beliefs. Instead of thinking about it as a switch, like, okay, I either believe this or I believe that, it's on and off. Think about it like a dimmer, right? Like, oh, I'm maybe 70% sure about this thing, but I can change it to 50% if someone gives me some new information, some new evidence, because it really is about tying up with your ego. And I think you're exactly right that like when we have response systems now, or like gamified, we have a gamified world where you're given a certain amount of like, happy feelings. From taking a certain position, from making a certain stance, from describing the world in a certain way. You don't want to lose those feelings by saying, maybe I was wrong, maybe I should change my mind about this, maybe it's a little bit different. We've set up incentive systems that make us behave in like really antisocial and like anti-intellectual ways. And I think your practice that you just described is very healthy. It's like you're setting up a new incentive system for yourself. You're saying, actually, my viewers really like appreciate it when I admit that maybe I was wrong about something, or maybe it's a little bit different than I thought before.
My opinions change, not all the time, but periodically, like, fairly absolute on 2A. I used to be like, well, there's got to be some things we can do. We need to have conversations. There's urban versus rural. And now I'm just at this point where I'm like, nah, everybody gets guns. Government should be giving guns away for free. Give everybody guns. I'm half kidding. I do argue, and this is important, why the government should give away free guns is that the right never fights for anything. And they say, a lot of the conservatives are like, it's because we don't think the government should be providing these things. And I'm like, well, here's the imbalance. The left will demand universal health care. They'll demand government do things for them. And then all the conservatives will do is say, no. Conservatives never actually advocate for things on their own within reason. It doesn't have to be about giving someone something, but I'm actually taking this from Michael Malice. God, we quote this guy too much. But he said the left demands universal health care. The right doesn't demand universal gun access. But I will say the real argument is, where are the Republicans coming out and demanding a repeal of the National Firearms Act? Where are the conservatives coming out and saying, we don't want the government to do things, we want to reduce, they don't do that. So you end up with the left constantly demanding things and taking it, and the right doing a whole lot of just saying stop.
Yeah, I mean, I've written a couple pieces actually for the Washington Examiner, which is a DC-based magazine that's right-leaning, is like kind of center-right or right of center, about sort of the debates within the conservative movement about where their governing philosophy should be going in the next few years. And I think for many years, the conservative movement has basically been tantamount in many ways to the libertarian movement, right? Like their general philosophy is government should take their hands off stuff. We should spend less money. We should have less regulations. And we should just embrace personal responsibility and individual freedom. I think there is a rethink happening about that in many parts of the right now. It's not a dominant philosophy. It's not something you'd see the McCarthys and McConnells of the world embracing, but I do think you're seeing some people in the Senate and the House and a lot of people on the intellectual right starting to say, hey, look, we can't really respond to the collapse of the family by just talking about another tax cut, right? Like,
right.
It's not that you should never cut taxes, you should never deregulate anything, but there has to be kind of a broader kind of social and political and economic agenda than I think just the libertarian mottos. And it's really interesting and kind of what you just said about guns, because I think one way that gun policy may be different in some parts of the world is that they, like gun ownership in a place like Switzerland, right? Like people, it's not super unusual to like have like training for your firearm, to have a firearm. They often keep them locked up, or they keep the ammunition separate or something, but like they don't necessarily see it as antagonistic to gun rights to have the government involved in it at some level. Whereas here in the U.S., the debate's very polarized, where there's some people who just absolutely hate guns and don't think anyone should own one. And then there's other people who just, they think everyone and their mom and their baby should own a gun, but like they aren't necessarily saying, okay, the government should put together, a really cool training course and give it to kids when they hit high school in this rural area where a lot of people own guns, and like actually get people's buy-in and confidence, and get like people who are not gun enthusiasts thinking, okay, there's a way they can use these things safely, and there's a way we can make sure people have access to them and good training and so on and so forth.
Yeah, the gun thing, I think, is one of the most glaring examples of the media lying and having no idea what they're talking about. And so, like, very early on in the gun debate, I just would do basic research as a journalist, and I started to learn more and more and more about how, wrong the media was. And they're still wrong to this day. Constantly saying things that make no sense, advocating for the ban of things that don't do anything. The example I love to give is that in Maryland, the M1A is banned as an assault weapon, but the SCAR 20S is not. And for people who know anything about guns, you'd probably be like, that's a weird thing to do, because the M1A it's a great weapon, but the SCAR 20S is more customizable, adaptable, easier in a lot of ways, I suppose, but just more modern and better. And I guess depending on who you ask, some people might like the M1A. But the fact of the matter is, this is what you get from media disinformation. You get policies that make no sense, and you get the escalation and the indoctrination. So actually, taxes are a really great idea. We've talked about taxes quite a bit. I think, Ian, you were the one mentioning that like early on, the first income tax was like 2% or something.
Oh, I don't know the number.
I think we were having a conversation a while ago, and you were like, initially the income tax was going to be like, it was only for the rich, and it was only supposed to be like 2%. And they were like, it's just the rich, it won't affect you. And now here we are with like 35 to 45% total taxes, not just income tax. Like, I think they say the average person will pay 45% of their income in taxes when it comes to sales tax, property tax, gas taxes, whatever, food, sales, all that stuff. And it used to be none. But what happens is they'll come out and they'll say, we just want this teeny bit. you give them an inch to take a mile. That's why the gun rights advocates in this country are adamant about giving nothing away, because they know that it's just chipping away at the block and eventually it's all gone. Did you look it up? Or?
Yeah, it was 3%, 1861 President Lincoln. And that eventually, I believe, got repealed to later get recreated by the Federal Reserve in 1914, I think. 1913, 14, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues where this headed up was school shootings, right? Like people, I think we had some very high-profile school shootings in the United States. Columbine in the 1990s, we had Newtown and Parkland. It's really shocked a lot of people's conscience. It was heavily covered in the media, and I think it produced a policy response that was, it was very well intended. I think people were legitimately scared for their children. But now I looked it up, and like a majority of states, I think around a majority or at least half, actually require students in schools to do school shooting drills. Like, off the top of your head, do you know how many students die every year in a school shooting?
What's the number?
It's 10. It's around 10 on average, right?
Many,
it's like,
and how many students are there?
Must be 70, 75 million, something like that, under 18. Yeah. So, school shootings, of course, are tragic. But what's the impact of having, tens of millions of kids, hiding in the hallways, under desks, being in kind of a war posture, right, within their schools? Even Everytown, which is one of the gun control groups, did some studies on this and found that it increased anxiety, increased depression, and now they're advocating for reform, saying we shouldn't be doing, all these all the time, because I think it was a knee-jerk reaction to a highly charged issue. And I think that we've seen a lot of that during COVID-19 as well, which is where people, I think, one of the phrases that comes to mind is better safe than sorry, right? You can't overprotect someone. But what I always say is, like, if you're overprotecting people from one thing, you could be underprotecting them from another thing, right? If we install all these measures on children against something which they almost completely unlikely they'll ever face it, we may be underprotecting them against things like anxiety, depression, long-term kind of suicidal tendencies, all kinds of cognitive distortions about fear of things that really they shouldn't be all that afraid of. We're not if you think entirely about protecting a population from one thing, you can underestimate the risk from all sorts of other things. And I think reframing it that way might be one way for us to be able to rethink some of these like overreactions to some of these threats that we face historically.
Thanks for checking out this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. If you want to see the full show, come back to this channel, youtube.com/TimcastIRL, Monday through Friday at 8 p.m., where you can leave comments and super chat, and we actually will read your comments on the show. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and if you want exclusive members-only content, segments you can't get anywhere else, go to timcast.com, become a member, and we even have full bonus episodes. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.